The fiscal year 2011 budget from the administration focuses on spurring job creation, securing the middle class, and putting the nation back on a path to fiscal sustainability. First, let's examine where we have come from. Over the past year, we have averted a second Great Depression. At the end of 2008, the economy was declining by more than 5% on an annualized basis. At the end of 2009, it was expanding by more than 5% on an annualized basis. A very substantial share of that shift has to do with the policy actions that were undertaken to avert a second Great Depression. Now, while the economy is expanding, the employment market remains unacceptably weak. The unemployment rate is 10%. There have been 7 million jobs lost since December 2007, and that is why the President is stepping forward with proposals like the new jobs and wages tax credit that's intended to help spur hiring today, especially among our small businesses. It's also why we must, while investing in education, innovation, and clean energy, bring down our deficits over time, because eventually those deficits will impede ongoing job creation. Now, what about the pre-existing condition with regard to our fiscal front? The President, in visiting with our Republican friends, pointed out that on January 7th, 2009, the Congressional Budget Office issued an economic and budget outlook that showed very clearly an increase in spending from fiscal year 2008 at 20.9% of the economy to fiscal year 2009, 24.9% of the economy, a 4 percentage point of GDP increase before the Obama administration even took office. And what happened in reality? In reality, spending in 2009 was actually slightly lower than CBO initially projected, coming in at 24.7% of the economy. There's a different mix. Mandatory spending was lower, discretionary spending somewhat higher because of the Recovery Act, but total spending was basically in line with what was initially projected in early 2009. What about our medium-term deficits? In early 2009, medium-term deficits over the next decade of $8 trillion were already apparent, assuming continuation of the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts and the Medicare prescription drug benefit, neither of which were paid for, and which add more than $5 trillion to our projected deficit, and because of the economic downturn, which reduces revenue and increases spending on certain programs like unemployment insurance and food stamps, the combined effect of those so-called automatic stabilizers adding more than $2 trillion to the projected deficit. Now, that's all an explanation of the situation in which we found and find ourselves, but the key question, as I think both Mr. Spratt and Mr. Ryan identified, is what do we do about it? And I think the first step is to embody or embrace the basic principle that we shouldn't make the situation worse. The administration is glad that the Senate has joined with the House in passing statutory pay-as-you-go legislation, which embodies that basic principle, that you shouldn't pay for new proposals or new tax cuts. If we had lived by this principle in the past, our out-year deficits would be roughly 2% of GDP, and debt as a share of the economy would be declining. We didn't live by it then, but we should now. Second, economic recovery will help to reduce the deficit. And under our projections, we move from a deficit of about 10% of the economy this year to roughly 5% of the economy by 2015 as the economy recovers. Unfortunately, that 5% of the economy is still higher than our fiscal target, which is roughly 3% of the economy. At that level, debt to GDP, or debt as a share of the economy, would stabilize. So how do we get from 5 to 3? The first thing we do is we put forward specific proposals to reduce the 10-year deficit by $1.2 trillion. Let me repeat that. The budget embodies, even not counting the winding down of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction, more deficit reduction than embodied in any administration budget in over a decade. How do we do that? A variety of steps. A new financial services fee, raising $90 billion imposed on financial services firms with more than $50 billion in assets, which will not only discourage leverage, but also meet the statutory requirement of repaying taxpayers in full for the costs of the TARP legislation. Second, we allow the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts for those families with more than $250,000 in income to expire as scheduled in 2011. That reduces the deficit by almost $700 billion over the next decade. Third, in order to help spur the clean energy economy of the future, a direction in which we must move, we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, reducing the deficit by $40 billion over the next decade. And finally, we have a freeze on non-security discretionary spending, which reduces the deficit by $250 billion over the next decade. I'd note that freeze is not across the board. We are investing more in education, in R&D, and in clean energy, while reducing spending in other areas in order to achieve that overall freeze. And I'd also, perhaps during the question and answer period, like to address the claim about more than an 80% increase before the freeze was imposed. Even with those steps, the out-year deficits are higher than we would like, which is why we are calling for a bipartisan fiscal commission to get us the rest of the way. It is very clear that in order to address our medium-term deficits, we will need to act together. And that is the purpose of the bipartisan fiscal commission, to take the additional steps necessary to reduce our medium-term deficits to a sustainable level and thereby allow ongoing economic activity and avoid the harm associated with deficits that are too high. Finally, let me just briefly point out that all of that has to do with our fiscal trajectory over the next decade. As you go out in decades beyond that, the key driver of our long-term deficit is the rate at which healthcare costs grow. And so I hope that we could come together to pass legislation that will help to not only improve quality and expand coverage, but reduce cost growth and reduce deficits over time in healthcare, because unless we do that, nothing else we do from a fiscal perspective will ultimately matter. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.